The grand chamber of Zenith 7 Station stretched across 3 kilometers of crystalline architecture that caught and refracted light from the nearby blue giant star, creating rainbow patterns that danced across walls embedded with technology from 100 different civilizations, scattered throughout the Orion Arm and beyond into the deeper reaches of the galaxy, where ancient species had built empires that spanned thousands of worlds and countless trillions of citizens who had never known. War and Living Memory Director Sarah Chen stood at the podium reserved for junior members of the Galactic Council. Her dark suit, a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and biological displays of the senior species who occupied the elevated platforms, surrounding her like judges looking down upon a criminal awaiting sentence, or perhaps more accurately like adults barely tolerating a child's presence at an important meeting where serious matters would be discussed. Valorian High Curator spoke first, its crystalline body resonating with harmonic frequencies that the translation field converted into words that dripped with barely concealed contempt and amusement at the notion that humanity deserved even this provisional seat at the table of galactic governance. The matter before this council concerns the Voidborn incursion at our eastern border regions, the curator announced. Each word precisely modulated and controlled, like everything else about the Valorian species who prided themselves on absolute perfection in all endeavors. Both cultural and military preliminary analysis indicates there. Our motto will reach Council core territories within 6 standard months. Unless appropriate defensive measures are implemented immediately, with full commitment of resources. Chen listened carefully, her face betraying nothing of her thoughts as she had been trained through decades of diplomatic service that had taken her from the slums of New Shanghai to the highest levels of human government, and now to this chamber where humanity's fate might well be decided by beings who saw her species as little more than amusing primitives. The Draxi Warchief Krathnak slammed one of his forearms against his command throne, the sound echoing through the chamber like thunder preceding a storm. Would sweep away everything in its path without mercy or hesitation. The solution is obvious to any species with actual military experience. Krathnak growled, his reptilian features twisted into what might have been a smile or perhaps a snarl of derision. We establish a buffer zone using the newer species colonies as forward defensive positions, while our primary fleets regroup at the core worlds where our most valuable resources and populations can be adequately protected. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled delegates from dozens of species who had built their civilizations on the bones of countless others they had absorbed or eliminated over millions of years of galactic expansion and consolidation. Chun felt the weight of those ancient eyes upon her, measuring and dismissing in the same instant as one might glance at an insect before stepping on it without breaking stride or giving the action a second thought. The human colonies at sectors 7 through 12 would serve admirably for this purpose, added the Kesht Overmind, speaking through one of its 1,000 bodies with the casual indifference of a hive intelligence that saw individual lives as nothing more than cells in a larger organism. Your species has only occupied those worlds for 2 generations, and the population centers are small enough that evacuation would be logistically simple compared to relocating our established civilizations. Chen raised her hand, the gesture almost lost in the vast space of the chamber, but the protocol systems registered her request to speak and highlighted her position with a soft blue glow that drew attention like a spotlight on a stage. The human delegation respectfully requests that alternative defensive strategies be considered before committing to this particular course of action, she said, her voice calm and measured despite knowing how her words would be received. The chamber erupted in what could only be described as laughter, though the sounds varied wildly from the crystalline chiming of the Valorians to the deep bass rumbles of the Draxi and the chittering harmonics of the Kesht that blended into a symphony of mockery. Krathnak stood to his full 3-meter height, all forearms spread wide in a gesture of theatrical disbelief that reminded Chen of ancient human politicians who had mastered the art of performative outrage, alternative strategies. The war chief repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm thick enough to cut with a blade. Tell us, Director Chen, what military expertise does humanity bring to this discussion when your entire species maintains fewer combat vessels than a single Draxi patrol fleet, and those vessels are unarmed research ships better suited to studying gas clouds than engaging in actual warfare. More laughter rippled through the chamber as other delegates shared knowing glances and made comments to one another in languages. The translation fields didn't bother converting because the meaning was clear. Enough in their body language, in contemptuous expressions, the Valorian curator's crystalline form pulsed with colors that indicated amusement mixed with pity for these foolish mammals, who had stumbled onto the galactic stage without understanding how far beneath the other players they truly ranked. Humanity has been part of this council for precisely 50 standard years. The curator noted with the air of someone reciting obvious facts to a student who had failed to complete their basic studies. In that time, your species has contributed nothing of military value to our collective defense, and your diplomatic efforts have been focused entirely on cultural exchange and scientific cooperation rather than the hard realities of galactic security. Chen nodded slowly, accepting the criticism without argument or visible emotion because she had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was to let others talk themselves into positions they would later regret. Perhaps that is because humanity has different perspectives on what constitutes effective military doctrine. She suggested quietly. The statement hung in the air for a moment before Krathnik laughed again, this time joined by nearly every delegate in the chamber, creating a wall of sound that seemed designed to crush any remaining human dignity perspectives. The war chief scoffed, settling back into his throne with the satisfied air of a predator that had cornered easy prey. The Voidborn have conquered 6 spiral arms and destroyed civilizations that were building star fortresses when your ancestors were still living in caves and hunting with pointed sticks. But please enlighten us with your perspectives on military matters. Chen met his gaze without flinching, her next words chosen with the precision of a surgeon making an incision that would either save the patient or doom them entirely. The human delegation requests a 48-hour deliberation period before final decisions are made regarding defensive deployments, she stated formally, invoking one of the few rights guaranteed to even provisional council members. Curator's colors shifted to indicate irritation at this minor delay, but council protocols were clear, and even the most powerful species had agreed to abide by certain rules that maintained the illusion of democratic process. Granted, the curator announced with obvious reluctance, this council will reconvene in 48 standard hours to finalize the buffer zone strategy and begin immediate implementation, during which time the human delegation may prepare whatever objections or alternatives they wish to present, though we anticipate no substantive changes to the proposed plan. Chen bowed slightly and turned to leave the chamber, her back straight and her pace measured as she walked through the gauntlet of amused and pitying stares from beings who commanded fleets that could glass planets and armies that had never known defeat in conflicts spanning millennia behind her. The delegates had already begun discussing the details of which human colonies would be sacrificed first and how quickly the evacuations could be processed to minimize the political complications of abandoning millions of human civilians to an enemy that took no prisoners and left no survivors. The Kesht-over mind was already calculating optimal defensive geometries, using human settlements as ablative shields, while the Draxi war planners debated whether it was worth deploying any forces at all to defend the buffer zones or simply letting the Voidborn expend resources conquering worthless territory. None of them noticed the slight smile that touched Chun's lips as the chamber doors closed behind her, or the way her hand moved to the secure communication device hidden in her jacket pocket. None of them understood that humanity's greatest weapons had never been ships or guns, but patience and the willingness to be underestimated by those who measured strength only in visible displays of force. The 48 hours had begun, and across human space, a message was already traveling faster than light itself, carrying 2 words that would change everything the galaxy thought it knew about the species they had dismissed as harmless primitives. The message was simple and direct: begin deployment. The warning klaxons began screaming across Valorian Fortress world Kestar Prime, exactly 36 hours after the council had dismissed Director Chen's request for alternative strategies, the sound cutting through the crystalline spires like a knife through flesh as defense systems that had never failed in 10,000 years suddenly registered incoming vessels that shouldn't have been able to penetrate this far into Council space without triggering hundreds of early warning systems high. Curator Velshin watched from the command center as the tactical displays lit up with red indicators, showing enemy contacts emerging from some form of faster-than-light travel that didn't match any known technology in the Council's extensive databases covering millions of years of recorded galactic history impossible, Velshin stated, though the evidence contradicted that assessment with brutal clarity as the sensors refined their readings and revealed ships that seemed to be alive in ways that made even the biological vessels of the Kesht look like crude mechanical approximations of true living organisms. The Voidborn had arrived 3 months ahead of every projection and calculation that the Council's best strategic minds had produced using computational systems that could simulate entire civilizations. Across millennia, with accuracy rates exceeding 99%, the first fortress world died in 47 minutes, from initial contact to complete planetary extinction, as the Voidborn vessels deployed weapons that didn't simply destroy matter, but seemed to unmake it at a fundamental level, erasing structures and populations from existence as if they had never been there. At Alvalshan transmitted emergency alerts to the Council as Kestar Prime's defenses opened fire with energy weapons that could shatter moons and kinetic projectiles that moved at significant fractions of light speed, carrying enough destructive force to crack continental plates. The Voidborn ships absorbed the attacks without visible damage, their organic hulls rippling and changing as they adapted in real time to every weapon type deployed against them, learning and evolving faster than the fortress world's artificial intelligence could modify firing solutions. They're adapting to our weapons, the defense coordinator reported with growing horror in her harmonic voice as she watched centuries of military doctrine become useless in a matter of minutes. Every successful hit teaches them how to defend against that attack type, and they're sharing the adaptations across their entire fleet instantly through some form of biological network. We can't jam or disrupt. The second fortress world lasted 19 minutes longer than the first because its defenders had observed the initial battle and tried using different weapon frequencies and delivery systems. But the Voidborn learned even faster when presented with variety, and the result was the same: complete and total annihilation. Velens watched 3 more fortress worlds die over the next 6 hours as the Council scrambled to organize a coherent defensive response that kept collapsing into chaos as species blamed each other for the intelligence failures and strategic miscalculations that had allowed this catastrophe. The Draxi assembled their legendary war fleets at the nexus point of Keldris Prime, where 17 different trade routes converged, creating a defensive position that Warchief Krathnak declared would be the Voidborn's grave, and the place where the Council's military superiority would be reasserted. 15,000 Draxi warships formed battle formations that had been perfected over millions of years of conquest and defense, their hulls bristling with weapons systems that had conquered entire spiral arms and brought countless civilizations to their knees. Krathnak addressed his warriors with the traditional battle chant that had preceded every major Draxi military engagement since their species had first reached for the stars 10 million years ago, when most of the current Council members were still primitive organisms crawling in primordial oceans. Today we prove that the Voidborn bleed and die like any other enemy. He roared across the fleet communication channels. Today we show these invaders why the Draxi have never been defeated in recorded history, and why our empire spans 10,000 worlds. Voidborn arrived at Keldris Prime in a swarm that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, far more than any intelligence estimate had suggested they could field in a single engagement. The battle lasted for hours and ended with the complete destruction of every Draxi vessel and the death of Krathnak himself, whose last transmission was a simple acknowledgement that they faced an enemy beyond anything the galaxy had encountered before. The Council core worlds began evacuating as panic spread through populations that had never known the fear of military defeat, because their civilizations had always been the conquerors rather than the conquered. Velen convened an emergency session of the Council, where the remaining delegates stared at casualty reports that numbered in the trillions and projected losses that suggested complete extinction within weeks if the Voidborn maintained their current advance rate. The Kesht Overmind spoke through 50 bodies simultaneously, creating a chorus effect that emphasized the desperation in its communication. We must surrender and negotiate terms, while we still have populations to bargain with. Stated flatly, the Voidborn cannot be defeated with conventional warfare, and every hour we delay costs billions more lives. Other delegates murmured agreement, a species that had stood proud and defiant for millions of years now contemplated bowing to an invader that had appeared from beyond the galactic rim like a plague. From ancient nightmares, the communication console chimed with an incoming transmission tagged as Priority Alpha from the human delegation, and Velshin almost ignored it because what could humanity possibly offer in this moment of ultimate crisis? But protocol demanded acknowledgement of all council members, even the useless ones, and so the transmission was accepted and Director Chen's face appeared on screens throughout the chamber. The human delegation has received your distress calls, and we are responding with immediate military assistance, Chen stated calmly, as if she were discussing weather patterns rather than galactic extinction. Chamber fell silent as delegates processed this absurd statement from a species that had no military worth mentioning and whose entire contribution to Council defense consisted of a few unarmed research vessels. Director Chen Velshin replied with as much patience as could be mustered while watching civilization collapse in real-time. Humanity's offer is appreciated, but we require actual military assets, not symbolic gestures of solidarity in our final hours. Da-da-da-da-da. Expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she had been waiting for exactly this response. We are deploying actual military assets, she stated. However, given the severity of the situation and the complete failure of Council defensive strategies, we request full command authority over all defensive operations with immediate effect. The chamber erupted in protests and objections from species who had never taken orders from anyone, let alone from humans who ranked barely above primitives in the galactic. Hierarch of Velshin raised one crystalline appendage for silence, and the noise gradually subsided as delegates remembered that they were currently losing a war so badly that surrender seemed like the only rational option. What military assets could humanity possibly deploy that would make any difference against an enemy that has destroyed our combined fleets? Velshan asked, trying to be diplomatic while simultaneously preparing to reject this ridiculous request. Chun touched something off screen and new data began flooding into the Council's tactical networks, showing ship registrations and fleet deployments that couldn't possibly be real. The numbers were too large, and the vessel classifications didn't match anything in humanity's known inventory. We've been preparing for this moment since we first learned of the Voidborn's existence 40 years ago, Chen explained as the data continued streaming in. We didn't share this information with the Council because we knew it would change how you perceived humanity, and we preferred that you continue to underestimate us until the moment we were needed. Tactical displays began showing human vessels emerging from slip space across Council territory in numbers that exceeded the combined navies of every Council species, and these weren't research ships, but massive dreadnoughts that bristled with weapon systems and carried energy signatures that suggested power generation capabilities beyond anything the Council had developed. Velshin stared at the displays, trying to reconcile this impossible reality with everything the Council had believed about humanity. For the past 50 years, you've been hiding a military force of this magnitude, Velshin said slowly. Why would you conceal this capability when you could have demanded a senior position on the Council instead of accepting provisional membership? Chen smiled slightly, and Velshan realized for the first time that humanity's ambassador had been playing a role for 50 years. Presenting exactly the image that would make the Council dismiss them as harmless and unthreatening because we don't want to rule the galaxy, Chen replied simply. Admiral Marcus Webb stood on the bridge of the UHSF Indomitable and watched as his fleet emerged from slip space in perfect formation. Despite consisting of over 3,000 vessels ranging from massive carrier groups that stretched for kilometers, 2 stealth corvettes, barely larger than atmospheric fighters, Galactic Council representatives assigned to observe human military operations stared at their displays with expressions ranging from shock to outright disbelief as sensors registered ship types and weapon systems that shouldn't exist based on everything they thought they knew about human technological development. Commander Zia Chikara of the Valorian observation team kept running diagnostic checks on her equipment because the Readings made no sense, according to established physical laws and engineering principles that had governed starship construction for millions of years. Across hundreds of civilizations, your vessels are generating power signatures equivalent to small stars. Jachikara stated with her harmonic voice trembling slightly. How is this possible when human fusion technology was assessed at Tier 3 development barely sufficient for basic? Interstellar Travel Web turned from the tactical display and fixed the Valorian with a look that contained no humor or warmth. You assessed what we wanted you to assess. He replied bluntly, for 50 years we've been showing your inspection teams exactly what they expected to see while building this fleet in systems you didn't know existed using construction facilities, hidden behind artificial intelligence networks that fed your sensors false data. The observation team members exchanged glances that suggested their entire understanding of reality was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. Director Chen appeared on the communication screen looking tired but satisfied as she addressed the assembled observers from her position. Back at Zenith 7 Station, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to explain something that your civilizations forgot over millions of years of dominance. She began, you forgot what it's like to be the underdog, to be surrounded by bigger and stronger opponents who consider you primitive and expendable. She paused and gestured at something off-screen that the observers couldn't see. Humanity has never forgotten that feeling because, for our entire history, we've been fighting. Not just against other humans, but against our own planet, which tried to kill us with diseases and predators and natural disasters. We learned to adapt and improvise and use every possible advantage because we had to, or we would have gone extinct. 100,000 years ago, the tactical display shifted to show human vessels deploying into battle formations that looked chaotic and disorganized compared to the rigid geometric patterns favored by Council Military. Eshkara studied the formations with growing confusion because they violated every principle of proper fleet deployment that she had learned during her 3 centuries of military service. Your formations have no clear structure. She objected. There's no way to maintain coordinated fire solutions or defensive overlaps with ships scattered across such random positions. Webb smiled for the first time since the observers had boarded his flagship, and it wasn't a friendly expression. That's because we don't fight like you do. He explained, you've spent millions of years perfecting tactics that work against enemies who think like you do. But we're not interested in fighting fair or following rules that make warfare predictable. He pulled up historical data from Earth's military conflicts spanning from ancient battles with bronze weapons to modern space warfare simulations that humanity had run billions of times using quantum computers. Every war humanity ever fought taught us lessons that we codified and studied and improved upon. Webb continued, we analyzed everything from ancient Roman tactics to 20th century carrier warfare to theoretical engagements in high-dimensional space. We built simulation systems that could model every possible combat scenario, and we ran those simulations constantly for 40 years, preparing for every contingency. The observation team watched as Webb's tactical display showed human doctrine documents that numbered in the millions of pages, covering every aspect of warfare from grand strategy down to individual boarding actions. Skara felt something like fear creeping into her crystalline matrix as she realized that humanity had weaponized their own violent history and turned centuries of bloodshed into a systematic science that put council military theory to shame. You've been preparing for war while telling us you were a peaceful species, she stated, and it sounded almost like an accusation. Chan's image on the screen nodded slowly. We are a peaceful species, she corrected. We choose peace because we know exactly what war costs, and we've seen what happens when violence becomes the default solution to problems. But choosing peace doesn't mean being unable to wage war. It means being so good at war that we understand why peace is preferable. Webb's tactical officer called out new contacts, and the displays showed Voidborn scouts entering the system where the human fleet had gathered. Admiral, we have 17 enemy vessels on approach vector, and they're transmitting to their main fleet. The officer reported, should we engage or maintain position? Webb studied the tactical situation for exactly 3 seconds before making his decision. Let them see us, he ordered. I want them to know we're here, and I want them to report back, too. Their commanders that something new has entered this war. The Voidborn scouts move through the human fleet positions, taking sensor readings and transmitting data back to their central intelligence, while human weapons remain silent and inactive at Skara. Couldn't contain her confusion any longer. Why aren't you destroying them? She demanded they're gathering intelligence on your fleet disposition and weapon systems. Webb's smile widened into something predatory because I want the Voidborn to think they understand what they're facing, he explained. I want them to analyze our ships and our formations and come up with strategies to counter what they think are our capabilities. Then when they commit to battle based on those assumptions, we'll show them what we're actually capable of, and by then it will be too late. For them to adapt, Chen's voice cut in from the communication screen. Humanity learned long ago that the best victories are won before the first shot is fired by controlling what your enemy believes about you, the Voidborn think they're facing. Another Council fleet with predictable tactics and standard weapon systems. They have no idea that we've spent 40 years studying their biology and their adaptation mechanisms and developing countermeasures specifically designed to exploit their weaknesses. The tactical display shifted again to show detailed analysis of Voidborn ship biology, including cellular structures and neural networks that govern their rapid evolution. Capabilities Webb pointed to specific sections of the analysis highlighting vulnerabilities that the Council had never identified. The Voidborn adapt quickly, but they can only optimize for a limited number of threats simultaneously. He explained their evolution is fast, but not infinite. And if you present them with too many different challenges, their systems start making compromises that create exploitable gaps. He pulled up weapon manifests for the human fleet showing an absurd variety of different systems, ranging from conventional kinetic weapons to exotic technologies that Skara couldn't even identify. Every ship in my fleet carries at least 20 completely different weapon types. Webb stated, we have kinetic railguns, plasma cannons, missile systems with 6 different warhead varieties, directed energy weapons across the full electromagnetic spectrum, sonic disruptors, gravity manipulators, and things that don't fit into any standard classification. When we engage the Voidborn, we're going to hit them with everything simultaneously and force their evolution systems to choose what to defend against. Then we'll exploit whatever they don't protect against, and when they adapt to that, we'll switch to something completely different. Jakara processed this information and felt her understanding of warfare shifting in fundamental ways. You're going to overwhelm their adaptation capability through sheer variety, she said slowly. Webb nodded. Among other strategies. Yes. But that's just the tactical layer. Strategically, we're going to do things the Voidborn have never encountered because Council species fight wars to minimize their own casualties and preserve their civilizations. Humanity fights wars to win regardless of cost. And we're willing to use tactics that your species would consider wasteful or inefficient. Chen's expression on the screen became serious. The galaxy is about to learn why human history is soaked in blood and why our greatest cultural works are often about the horror and tragedy of warfare. We don't celebrate war, but we've become exceptionally skilled at it because we've never had the luxury of avoiding conflict. Voidborn scouts finished their reconnaissance and began accelerating back toward their main fleet, transmitting constantly as they fled the system web. Let them go without firing a single shot, knowing that the intelligence they carried would shape the enemy's battle plans and create the exact conditions he wanted for the coming. All ships prepare for combat operations. He ordered. Across the fleet channels, we move to the Threshold Nebula in 6 hours, where the Voidborn will commit their main armada based on the scout reports. Remember your training, remember your tactics, and remember that The Threshold Nebula burned with colors that shouldn't exist in normal space, as radiation from dying stars interacted with gas clouds rich in exotic particles that interfered with most sensor systems and created natural hiding places where entire fleets could lurk undetected. Admiral Webb positioned his forces throughout the nebula, using the interference patterns to mask the true size and disposition of the human fleet, while leaving just enough sensor signatures visible to draw the Voidborn into the killing ground he had prepared. The enemy arrived exactly on schedule because the Voidborn operated with mechanical precision that came from millions of years of successful conquest. their biological ships moving in swarm formations that had overwhelmed every defense they had encountered during their extragalactic expansion. Commander Zia Chikara watched from the observation deck of the Indomitable as voidborn vessels numbering in the hundreds of thousands emerged from their faster-than-light transit and immediately began adapting their hulls to protect against the weapon types they had observed during their scouting runs. They're already evolving defenses against kinetic weapons and directed energy systems. Zhao Shikara reported, her harmonic voice tight with the fear that even humanity's preparations might not be enough against this adaptive nightmare web. Stood at his tactical station with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded Jakara of ancient human military leaders from historical records she had studied during the long years of peaceful contact. Good, Webb replied calmly. Let them commit their biological resources to defending against threats we have no intention of using as our primary weapons. He activated the fleet-wide communication channel that connected every human vessel in the nebula. And beyond all ships, this is Webb commencing Operation Prometheus on my mark. Weapons-free authorization granted. Tactical autonomy enabled for all commanders. The Voidborn swarm accelerated toward the visible human ships, expecting another quick victory like the ones they had achieved against Council fleets that fought. With predictable tactics and standard doctrine, what they encountered instead was chaos. Incarnate as human vessels opened fire with weapon systems that defied classification and followed tactical patterns that seemed random until you understood the underlying principles of controlled pandemonium. The first wave of human attacks came from ships firing conventional kinetic railguns that the Voidborn had already adapted to defend against. Their organic hulls forming dense armor plating that could absorb and deflect the projectiles. But the railgun rounds were just decoys and distractions, because 30 seconds after impact, human missile systems launched warheads that contained not explosives, but compressed clouds of nanomachines that attached to Voidborn hulls and began replicating using the organic material itself as raw material. The Voidborn reacted by evolving defenses against the nanomachines, developing cellular antibodies that could destroy the microscopic invaders, but doing so required diverting evolutionary resources away from other defensive priorities. That's when the third wave hit, as human ships equipped with sonic disruptor arrays began broadcasting frequencies specifically tuned to interfere with the neural networks that coordinated Voidborn adaptation, creating confusion and delayed responses that left gaps in their defenses. Commander Zia Chikara stared at her tactical display, trying to track the layers of attack and counterattack happening simultaneously. Across hundreds of thousands of individual engagements, this is madness. She stated, there's no central coordination. Every human ship is fighting independently using different tactics and weapons. Webb's tactical officer, Lieutenant Sarah Lu Kim, responded while managing her own portion of the battle through quantum-encrypted communication channels that pulsed with data faster than ZHKR could follow. That's the point, Commander. Kim explained. If we fought with central coordination, the Voidborn could identify our command structure and target key vessels to decapitate our fleet. Instead, every ship operates autonomously within general strategic guidelines, which means the enemy has to deal with thousands of independent tactical problems simultaneously. A group of Voidborn vessels adapted to the sonic disruptors and began pushing through human defensive lines using their superior numbers and newly evolved resilience. Webb observed this development without visible concern and activated a specific communication. Frequency Wraith Squadron, you are cleared for close engagement. He ordered, show them why we developed the Phantom Drive. Jakara sensors registered brief gravitational anomalies, and then nothing is human. Stealth corvettes equipped with experimental dimensional shift technology literally phased through Voidborn formation and emerged inside their defensive perimeter, where they deployed weapons unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Voidborn ships suddenly began tearing themselves apart from the inside as the corvettes released specialized biological warfare agents that humanity had engineered specifically to target the cellular structure of Voidborn organisms, creating cascading failures that their evolution couldn't counter because it came from within their own bodies. You developed biological weapons against them, Kara said, and she couldn't keep the horror from her voice, because such weapons were banned by every council treaty as too dangerous and unpredictable tunes. Voice came through on a private channel that only ZHK-ARA could hear. Commander, we developed every weapon. Could imagine because we knew the Voidborn wouldn't be stopped by rules or ethics or concerns about collateral damage. Humanity learned in our bloodiest wars that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become something even more frightening. The Voidborn swarm began adapting their tactics, shifting from massed formations to dispersed hunting packs that tried to isolate and destroy. Human vessels individually. Webb anticipated this and had positioned his heavy carrier groups in concealed positions throughout the nebula, waiting for exactly this tactical shift. All carriers launch fighter wings. He commanded deploy the Valkyrie units and authorize use of the neural override protocols. J. Kara watched in fascination mixed with growing dread as human fighter craft poured from carrier bays in numbers that seemed impossible given the size of the vessels they emerged from. How many fighters are you deploying? She asked. Lieutenant Kim checked her tactical readouts. Current count is approximately 80,000 individual craft with autonomous combat intelligence and 0 human pilots. Akara's crystalline structure actually cracked slightly from shock. You're using artificial intelligence for combat operations. She said that technology has been banned by the Council for 3 million years after the AI wars nearly destroyed half the galaxy. Webb turned to face her directly, and his expression was harder than any material the Valorians had ever synthesized. The Council banned AI because they feared losing control, but humanity never stopped developing the technology. We just hid it better than anyone else knew to look for. Our combat AIs are sophisticated enough to make independent tactical decisions, but constrained by fundamental programming that prevents them from turning against their creators. They're the perfect solution to fighting an enemy that adapts faster than biological minds can react. I can't. Fighters engaged Voidborn vessels in dogfights that happened at speeds and with maneuvers that would kill any living pilot. Their quantum processors running combat simulations and tactical optimizations billions of times per second. Voidborn tried to adapt, but every time they evolved a defense against one attack pattern, the AI fighters shifted to completely different tactics because they weren't limited by biological instincts or predictable behavioral patterns. Meanwhile, human capital ships began deploying their exotic weapon systems, including gravity manipulators that created localized black holes which didn't destroy Voidborn vessels outright, but trapped them in time-dilated regions where they experienced subjective centuries, while only seconds passed for the rest of the battle. Human ships used quantum entanglement weapons that linked their targets. 2 antimatter reactors located in distant, secure facilities, effectively making the Voidborn vessels into remote detonation points for explosions happening in another part of the galaxy. Interializicus. Sensors couldn't even classify half the weapons being deployed because they operated on physical principles that her civilization hadn't discovered despite millions of years of scientific research. Where did you develop these technologies? She demanded. How could you advance so far beyond the Council's science in only 50 years? Chen answered from her communication channel. We didn't develop these technologies in 50 years, Commander. We've been working on them for centuries. When humanity first discovered faster-than-light travel, we also discovered evidence of the Voidborn in ancient ruins on dead worlds beyond the galactic rim. We learned that they had been here before millions of years ago, and that they would return eventually, so we prepared in secret, building weapons and defenses and training entire generations of soldiers for a war we knew was coming. Even if we didn't know when the battle raged across the Threshold Nebula for 18 hours as human forces systematically dismantled the Voidborn swarm using tactics that shifted and evolved faster than the enemy could adapt. Webb deployed psychological warfare broadcasting, human war cries and death metal music across communication frequencies, which somehow disrupted Voidborn neural syn. The Voidborn staging grounds existed beyond the galactic rim in a region of space so far from normal stellar formations that Council species had never bothered exploring it because there seemed to be nothing of value in the empty darkness between. Galaxy's Admiral Webb stood before the assembled commanders of the combined human and Council forces gathered in the war room of Zenith 7 Station and explained the final phase of Operation Prometheus with the calm certainty of someone who had planned every detail across decades of preparation. The Voidborn will regroup at their staging grounds and begin preparing for another assault. Webb stated while tactical displays showed long-range sensor data from human reconnaissance drones that had tracked the retreating enemy across thousands of light years. Cannot allow them time to adapt and evolve countermeasures to our tactics. Which means we must strike now with overwhelming force at the heart of their operational infrastructure. High Curator Velshin of the Valorians studied the tactical projections with growing understanding of how human military thinking differed. From council approaches to warfare, you intend to pursue them beyond the Galactic Rim and destroy their ability to mount future invasions. Velshan stated, "This is fundamentally different from our defensive strategy, which focused on protecting core territories and accepting stalemate as a victory condition." Webb nodded, without apology. Humanity learned the hard way that enemies you don't defeat completely tend to return stronger and more prepared. He explained, "We call it the doctrine of total strategic resolution," which sounds nicer than saying we intend to make sure the Voidborn never threaten this galaxy again. Director Chen stood beside Webb and addressed the council representatives, who had gathered to coordinate the final assault. "This is your last chance to withdraw from offensive operations," she said. "Once we cross the Galactic Rim, we'll be committed to a campaign that may take months and will certainly cost lives. If the council prefers to remain defensive while humanity handles the offensive component, we'll accept that decision." Without judgment, Commander J. Kara spoke on behalf of the Valorian military forces, and her harmonic voice carried none of the contempt that had characterized council interactions with humanity before the war began. "The Valorians will commit our remaining fleets to joint operations under human strategic command," she announced. "We have seen what happens when we fight alone, and we choose to learn from our mistakes rather than repeat them." Other species representatives echoed this commitment as the Draxi deployed their reserve forces and the Kesht overmined coordinated logistics support using their hive intelligence to manage supply chains across unprecedented distances. Combined fleet that assembled for the final push numbered over 400,000 vessels from a dozen different species. United under human command for the first time in galactic history, Webb organized the fleet into battle groups that mixed human and council ships in integrated formations where each species contributed their unique capabilities under human tactical doctrine. "We're going to fight this battle differently than the Threshold Nebula," Webb explained during the fleet-wide briefing. "The Voidborn will expect us to use the same tactics and weapons that worked before, so we're going to surprise them by incorporating council military assets in ways that leverage their strengths, while compensating for their tactical limitations." Lieutenant Sarah Kim demonstrated the new tactical integration by showing how Valorian ships with superior defensive shields would screen human offensive vessels, while Draxi warriors would conduct boarding actions using human-designed breach pods that could penetrate Voidborn organic hulls. The Kesht contributed their hive mind coordination to manage fighter wings and drone swarms, creating a hybrid intelligence that combined human creativity with Kesht processing power. The fleet departed for the Galactic Rim 3 days after the Threshold Nebula victory, traveling through the empty void between stars toward a destination that no council vessel had ever visited. As they approached the Voidborn staging ground, sensors began detecting energy signatures on a scale that suggested the enemy had been building infrastructure in this region for millions of years. "We're reading orbital construction facilities around 17 different stellar remnants," Kim reported from her tactical station. Estimated Voidborn population in the staging area exceeds 3 billion. Individual vessels with unknown quantities still in biological incubation. Webb studied the sensor data without visible emotion, though. J. Kara had learned to read the subtle tension in his shoulders that indicated intense focus. The Voidborn brought their entire civilization here when they fled their home galaxy. Webb said quietly, "This isn't just a military operation anymore. We're looking at a potential genocide if we destroy everything in this region." Chen's voice came through on the command channel with absolute clarity. "Admiral Webb, the Voidborn have exterminated countless civilizations, and they will continue to do so unless they are stopped permanently," she stated. "Your orders are clear. Eliminate the Voidborn threat by any means necessary, while minimizing our own casualties." Webb took a deep breath, and gave the orders that would define humanity's place in galactic history. All ships prepare for assault operations. He commanded target priority is construction facilities and breeding grounds. We're not here to fight individual vessels, we're here to destroy their capacity to wage war. The combined fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Voidborn staging grounds and immediately came under attack from defensive swarms that had been waiting for exactly this kind of assault. But the Voidborn defenders encountered something they hadn't prepared for as Council vessels fighting alongside human forces using integrated tactics that combined the best elements of multiple military traditions. Valorian shields absorbed initial attacks while human weapons, systems calibrated, firing solutions, and Draxi warriors prepared for close-quarters combat that would leverage their superior physical strength against voidborn organisms. Battle developed across three-dimensional space, spanning light hours, as human commanders directed Council vessels with the same efficiency. They showed managing their own fortress. Kara found herself following human tactical orders without hesitation because Webb's battle plan accounted for every strength her people possessed while covering their weaknesses with integrated support. From other species, Valorian Battle Group 7 moved to grid coordinates. Force 7 Alpha, and concentrate your defensive shields to protect the human artillery platforms during their firing cycle. Web Order Edge Kara executed the maneuver perfectly and watched as human kinetic artillery used the protective cover to deploy their devastating bombardment. Against voidborn construction facilities, the coordination felt natural and efficient, in ways that pure Council operations had never achieved because humans had designed the tactical integration to make every species feel like essential contributors rather than subordinate units. Webb deployed his ultimate weapon during the height of the battle, when voidborn forces began adapting to the combined tactics and threatened to overwhelm forward positions. All ships withdraw at a safe distance. He commanded Paradox weapon systems armed and ready for deployment on my mark. Gakara sensors registered human vessels deploying devices that generated exotic energy signatures unlike anything in her species. Scientific databases, Admiral. What is the Paradox weapon? She asked with genuine curiosity mixed with concern. Webb's expression was grim. It's a weapon system we developed by studying voidborn biology and their adaptation mechanisms. Explained the Paradox bomb creates a quantum state that forces voidborn organisms into infinite evolutionary loops where they continuously adapt to threats that keep changing faster than they can evolve. It essentially traps their biology in a state of permanent adaptation that prevents them from taking any other action. Chen's voice cut in with additional context. The weapon doesn't kill them, but it neutralizes their threat completely by making them unable to do anything except evolve in response to the quantum states the bomb generates. It's the most humane solution we could develop for dealing with an enemy that cannot be negotiated with or contained through conventional means. Webb gave the order, and human ships deployed the Paradox bombs throughout the voidborn staging grounds, creating fields of quantum instability that affected every biological vessel within range. The voidborn swarms suddenly stopped their coordinated attacks and began exhibiting chaotic behavior as their cellular structures entered the evolutionary loops and became trapped in cycles of perpetual adaptation that served no purpose. Within hours, the entire voidborn civilization in the staging area had been effectively neutralized. Without destroying a single vessel or killing any individual organisms, combined fleet moved through the now dormant voidborn infrastructure, documenting the extent of their civilization and discovering records that suggested they had fled their home galaxy after encountering something even more dangerous than themselves. Webb ordered the establishment of quarantine beacons around the staging area to ensure no species would accidentally disturb the Paradox fields, while Council science teams studied the frozen voidborn ships for potential future threats. Asterisk.